Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning and welcome to the second day of our FDP virtual meetings. It is wonderful to see so many of you, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Mushtaq Gunja, who is going to be our plenary speaker this morning. The impetus for this session is to help introduce the Carnegie classification changes that are going into effect next year to this audience, which, as he has been informed, is a group of research administrators, faculty, and federal representatives who all work together to strengthen the nation's research administration enterprise. I think this group will be very interested in some of the research changes, but also the broader classification changes. So thank you so much, Mushtaq, for joining us, and thank you to all of you for being here. Mushtaq is the executive director of the Carnegie Classification System and senior vice president of ACE. He serves as the person who is leading the charge in running and reimagining the Carnegie framework. Prior to joining ACE, he served as assistant dean in academic affairs at Georgetown Law Center. He was in charge of academic policies for the law school, including accreditation, teaching methods, and new programs related to increased educational outcomes. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law and previously taught at the University of Maryland School of Law and Washington Adventist University. Mushtaq also served as the chief of staff to the undersecretary at the U.S. Department of Education under President Obama. In this position, he provided strategic advice to the undersecretary in the development and implementation of policies across higher education, including improving access and affordability, highlighting promising practices to foster competition, to foster completion, encourage increased innovation, improving the borrower experience for students with federal loans, and ensuring fair treatment for all universities of higher ed. He also served in the Obama administration as Deputy Associate White House Counsel with responsibilities for vetting and confirming the president's political appointees. Mushtaq graduated cum laude from Harvard School of Law and magna cum laude with honors from Brown University and has a background in political science and diplomatic history. So I wanted to give you a little sense of his breadth of experience. And now I turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Mushtaq.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for having us or having me. And I'm so excited to be able to get to talk with this group about what we're thinking about doing with the Carnegie classification. So let me share screen. And as Michelle said, I'm a faculty member over at Georgetown Law School, and so I am both used to getting interrupted. So please put as many questions in the Q&A as you would like. I'm going to try to answer as many of them as I can. And it also means that the faculty member in me means that I never go anywhere without too many slides. So I think I have something like 60 slides for you. We'll see how many of them we can get through today. I am the executive director of the Carnegie Classifications, and that's a new thing for ACE. So in 2022, we announced, the American Council on Education announced with the Carnegie Foundation that the classifications would be coming over to ACE for us to help run them. And when we took these classifications on, they'd been being run out of Indiana University, we decided that we would sort of focus on a new type of classification, that we would create a new social and economic mobility classification. So that's what I thought I was going to be working on when we took this project on in March 22. But when I got into the guts of sort of the basic classification and the research part of the classification, we learned, or I learned, that there were a few changes that we wanted to make to the basic classification as well. And so in November of last year, we made an announcement about a couple of sort of fundamental shifts that we are making to the basic classification. So we are moving the basic classification from what is essentially a single label classification to something that's much more multidimensional. And we hope that in so doing will better sort of reflect what is happening in higher ed today. Spend probably 15 or 20 minutes today talking about the changes that we're going to make to the basic classification. While we got into the guts of the basic, we also learned that there were some some intricacies, some strangeness in the way that we were dealing with the research part of the classification and the research methodology. So we also announced in November 23 that we're going to be making some changes to the way that we consider R1s and R2s, our very high research activity and high research activity institutions. And we are also going to create a new category of research colleges and universities to better identify sort of the research that's happening all the way through the higher ed ecosystem. So probably spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about that. And once we're sort of through that section of the presentation, I'd love to pause, see if folks have questions, answer them. And then I think I'd like to be able to talk a little bit about the social and economic mobility classification. So let me take a big step back. In 2025, in the spring of next year, when we announce the new classifications, every institution in this country will have both a revised basic classification and a new social and economic mobility classification. So every institution will have two classifications, all 4,000 institutions that grant degrees. And then separately, we will be publishing a research list for the 300 some odd institutions that will be R1s or R2s, and then the other 350 or so institutions that are research colleges and universities. We will publish a separate list of R1 institutions, R2 institutions, but it will no longer be the case that an institution's basic classification will be an R1. You'll get a basic classification, you'll get a social and economic mobility classification, and your institution may be on a research list. Probably all of your institutions are here on this call, but there's some 3,000 institutions in this country that are not doing significant amounts of research. Timeline, just to sort of ground us in where we are and where we're going. We are sort of in the midst of gathering some feedback, just dealing with some last questions, and we're going to be making some final decisions on methodology in the next few weeks. In November, we will communicate with all of your institutions about exactly what the timeline is for release and the process for appeal if you have questions or concerns about where you are in the classification regime. And in January, just a few months, we will provide your draft basic classification and social and economic mobility classification and your research classification on embargo for review and appeal. For the research part, you'll get a few weeks to be able to appeal. For the other parts of the classification, which are a little bit more complicated, you'll have a little bit more time. We'll send you the exact sort of dates on that soon. And then we are on track, friends, to publish these new classifications in spring. Think late March, early April for the new classifications. And then after that, we will sort of get to the good work of, now that there will be new sort of peer groups and a new classification, we'll do some analysis, we'll do a lot of presenting about our findings, and we will spend some time talking to the states and other policymakers about what these classifications mean. So if that's the plan, let's talk about the basic classification, why this thing is important. So let's do a little bit of where are we? So this is the map for the last classification, the 21 classification. Just to let you know, this classification has been around, the Carnegie classifications, for 50 years. And they basically have looked like this map for the 50 years. So we start with all institutions at the top. Our tribal colleges have had a separate category for the last several cycles. So the 30-ish tribal colleges and universities are labeled as such. Then we have our special focus institutions, our 2-year and 4-year institutions that are granting most of their degrees, almost all of their degrees in one field. So think your standalone med schools or your, some of your arts institutions. And then we get down to sort of the guts of the classification, reading from right to left. We have our associates colleges, baccalaureate associate colleges, our baccalaureates, our master's colleges, and then our doctoral universities. In this part of the classification, these are our R1s and our R2s, our very high research activity institutions and our high research activity institutions. You are in exactly one of these boxes. And so if you're the sort of institution that primarily offers baccalaureate degrees, but does not offer more than 50 master's degrees, you'd be in the baccalaureate section. You're in the master's section if your institution offers at least 50 master's degrees, and so on and so forth. You can see that your institution is first given sort of this gold title, and then is given a sort of a separate title too, based on some other sort of determinants. As we tackle this institution or this classification, one of the things we sort of observed was um, this map might not be doing the best job of grouping like institutions. And part of the reason for that is the primary driver of your classification was the highest degree that your institution offered. And so your institution could offer um, 5,000 bachelor's degrees and 53 master's degrees. And notwithstanding the fact that the vast majority of the work that you were doing was on the baccalaureate space, you would be classified as a master's small institution here. Your institution could have 5,000 baccalaureate degrees, no master's degrees, and you know um, a professional practice doctorate of some sort, and that would push you from into the doctoral professional universities category. It was often the case that a very small percentage of the degrees that were being offered would drive your classification. And even within some of these classifications, we worried a lot about some institutions that were not very alike being in the same classification. So this is a set of three R1 institutions, and they're all in the same classification. And I think that it is fair to say that they have one thing and maybe only one thing in common, which is that they're all doing a tremendous amount of research. And that's great. It's very important for us to be able to sort of note which institutions are doing a lot of research. But for every other sort of purpose, they're pretty different types of institutions. They're offering different types of degrees. Their student bodies are very different, the types of, both from a Pell percentage, a racial diversity perspective. I mean, they're very different organizations. They were all classified the same way. Now, that wouldn't be a problem, except that the Carnegie classifications are used in all sorts of different ways for all sorts of different reasons. And so it's actually really important that we group like institutions together because the classifications are used for federal reporting. They're used for a whole set of institutional research. Media organizations, including U.S. News, uses them for their rankings for sorting institutions into their best colleges list. And they're used by the states, maybe most importantly, in a variety of different ways, including for many different funding decisions. So let's start with the U.S. News, and I'll talk about the states in just a second. But where you are on this map determines where you are in the U.S. News rankings. So our national universities, our doctoral universities are considered national universities, and our master's colleges are considered regional universities. Now, this is despite the fact that nowhere on this map did the Carnegie classifications previously sort of think about regionality, right? You may well be an institution that's drawing from sort of a national audience and be in this section, because all it means to be a master's college is that your institution offers more than 50 master's degrees, but doesn't offer 20 doctoral degrees. Nevertheless, our friends over at US News, our friends and our frenemies over at US News decided that they would take our Carnegie classifications and slap these labels on institutions based on where they were here on our Carnegie classifications. And so one of the things that was sort of interesting about taking this job is probably in the first couple of months, I got a call from, I don't know, 15 or 20 institutions saying, can you please change our Carnegie classification? Because US News has put us in a bucket here of national or regional university or national college or regional college that we don't like. And sometimes it would be that institutions wanted to move from the national college list up to the regional university list, or sometimes would want to go from the national university list to the regional university list, just based on where they sort of perform better. So every once in a while, an institution would want to be sort of the number 4 institution in the West, as opposed to the 175th institution on the national list, or vice versa, which is all fine and good. It just doesn't really have anything to do with our Carnegie classifications. It was a conversation that we needed to have with US News. So this is one way in which the Carnegie classifications are used by the system, and this time without permission. They're also used by a whole set of states. So we've started just diving into this question of how are the states using the Carnegie classifications, and we found in our initial research that at least 25 states are using the classifications to make policy and funding decisions. So you might see some of your states on this list. And it's at least 25 states. Our instinct actually is that it's probably another 5 or 10 on top. And sometimes it drives funding, right? So you can see that it drives just sometimes straight institutional funding. It's sometimes included in some of the performance-based funding measures. Louisiana uses it to sort of help determine some of the FTE considerations. And then one of the things we really have found lately is that um, different states will pay faculty differently based on where you are in the Carnegie classifications. So, um, you know, in some places, faculty that are at doctoral universities will get paid more than if you're at master's colleges and universities, sort of despite the other amounts of research that you're doing. So you might be doing the same amount of research at a master's college as you are in a doctoral university. Nevertheless, you'll get paid more if you're at an R1 or an R2. That's one of the things that we found in several states. And certainly because of that, states have been using their dollars to sort of further the R1, R2 chase. I think it won't be a surprise to anybody on this call that um, the states care a lot about how many R1s they have in their states. Um, I don't have Texas on this slide, but I've been in Texas a bunch lately, and the legislature, the governor's office, the system as a whole has been laser focused on trying to get as many institutions to be R1 as possible. But you can see here just a smattering of the ways in which states have been thinking about trying to drive their institutions to R1. And the states are using the classifications in all sorts of other ways as well. So faculty workload, we have a set of elective classifications, Carnegie electives, including the best known of which is the community engagement classification. So Florida, Maryland, Minnesota have directives to try to get their institutions to all be community engagement classified. Just a variety of ways in which these classifications are used. Okay, so the fact that they're used so widely means that I think it's actually incredibly important that we get this part of it right, that we're actually grouping like institutions together. Because if, for instance, accreditors are using the classifications to be able to think about who are like institutions for quality purposes, for the basis of sort of trying to understand whether or not an institution is doing well enough, it's really important that we're, comparing Cal State LA to Cal State Northridge and not Cal State LA to Princeton. That it's a different sort of institution. So very important, I think, that we get these groupings right. So the previous regime had these are institutions classified by the highest degree that they offered. We're going to take a different approach going forward. We're going to do something that's a little bit more I call this my Myers-Briggs slide, something a little bit more Myers-Briggsy, where instead of just looking at highest degree, we're going to look at a variety of factors, a variety of indicators that your institution be able to group like things together. So we've been playing now for about a year with the boxes that we might use here, but you can imagine that instead of just sorting institutions by highest degree, we can look at the degree mix. What are the types of degrees and certificates that your institution offers? What are the programs within them? Are you more of a humanities school, more of a STEM school? Do you specialize in the arts, for instance? We could look at size. We might still look at highest degree. And you can sort of imagine a whole variety of factors. But instead of just looking at highest degree, we will use some combination of factors. And we've been playing with this for about a year, and we've sort of refined it probably to a few factors. We've been spending a lot of time thinking about award level focus, meaning, do you offer a mix of sort of baccalaureate, certificates, associate, are you that sort of institution? Do you only award master's degrees? Do you do baccalaureate, master's, and doctoral? Award level focus is one thing we've been thinking about. We've been spending a lot of time on that academic program mix. So the types of degrees that you offer, which zip codes do they land in? And then we've been thinking about size and highest degree as well. But if you did that, you can imagine that the basic classification for an institution might be that they're a type B in award level focus, type G in an academic program mix, and then a type M in size. And your Carnegie classification would then be like a BGM. We'd have to figure out the right letters and the right labels for all of that. And that'll be the work over the next 6 weeks. But you're likely to have a more of a multidimensional approach. What that will mean is that your institutions, for Carnegie classification purposes, will be with a different set of peer groups probably than what your previous peer group was in the Carnegie classifications. And so you can imagine that when you go on carnegieclassifications.acenet.edu, which I'm sure you all are doing every day, as I am right now, if you looked up Southern Illinois University Carbondale, it would just tell you one thing. It would tell you that they were an R2 institution, a high activity, high research activity institution. Instead, I think when we, going forward, when you click on an institution, I think we're hoping to have a much more rich sort of way of being able to talk and think about the institution. And so you can imagine that we'll have some version of a pie chart that explains the sort of the quality, the texture of the degrees that are being offered, and then perhaps something around the boxes that you see to the left here. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about the basic classification. Maybe the big takeaway is, look, this thing is going to change. You've had a particular classification for the last 50 years, and we are moving away from highest degree to something that's more multidimensional. Let me talk about research and what that is going to look like, and then maybe I can pause and take a breath. Actually, let me just grab a sip of my coffee. And let's talk about research, if that's okay. So, it won't surprise anybody that probably 80, 85, 90% of the conversation around the Carnegie classifications have really been around the research part of the classification, the R1, R2 thing. And when we took this project on in 2022, I did a little bit of a listening tour and went around the country, just talked to as many institutions and associations as I could to just sort of understand how they were experiencing the Carnegie classifications. And here are some of the things that we heard around research and the research methodology. So first, there's no question that R1, R2 chase is real. It's not just a myth, but I mean, institutions are very, very focused on trying to become R1 institutions. And I think that one of the things that we sort of understood was that institutions wanted to be R1 because they thought that it was a marker of research quality and impact. That R1 meant not just that your institution was doing a lot of research, but that it was a very high quality of research, that in some sense, these were our best research institutions. And it turns out that in some sense that might be right, but it's not because of what we're measuring, as we'll talk about in just a second. Um, you know, that first month that I took on the project, I think I got a call from about 10 R2 institutions that called me up and said, great, it's coming over to ACE. Can you tell us what we need to do to become an R1 institution? Because the methodology for how an institution moved from R2 to R1 was complex. It wasn't well understood. That's partially because of this penultimate bullet here. The R1 cut, the R1 R2 cut, is a relative sort of ranking that splits up our institutions between R1s and R2s. And it was a normative one in some ways and slightly arbitrary for some reasons that I'll talk about in just a second. But let's talk about sort of the history of the research methodology. So we've always had R1 institutions and R2 institutions in the classifications. We've had them for the 50 years. 1973 was the first publishing of the classifications. And in the first two cycles of the Carnegie classifications, we simply split up our R1s and R2s by federal research grants. The top 50 institutions, if they awarded 50 PhDs, were R1s. And then next 50 were R2 institutions, and that was it. It's just a straight sort of who's done the most in terms of research grants. In 87 and 94, they changed the methodology to something that was a little bit more textured. So an R1 institution was an institution that received a certain amount of research grants. It was 33.5 million, then 40 million, and then awarded 50 PhDs. And then our R2 institutions had those separate sort of cutoffs between 12.5 and 33 million and awarded more than 50 PhDs. So those were our R1s and R2s. In 2000, they scrapped that and they went to sort of a different sort of ranking altogether, which was just about PhDs across disciplines. So if you awarded more than 50 PhDs across 15 disciplines, you were a research extensive institution. And then if you awarded 10 PhDs that were more sort of focused, you were a research intensive methodology classified institution. Apparently, the field didn't like that very much. Some of you might have experienced those classifications back in 2000. And so they scrapped that and they moved to the methodology that we have today in 2005, where there were some cutoffs to become an R2 institution. So if your institution awarded more than 20 research PhDs and spent more than $5 million in expenditures, you were eligible to sort of be an R1 institution. You would at least be an R2 institution. And then we would do the work after you met that threshold of dividing up our R1s and our R2s. And how would we do that? Well, we use this very complex methodology. And I say complex, maybe it isn't too complex to you, but it's complex to certainly a whole set of R2s that were unable to sort of crack this math. So let me explain how we divided up our R1s from our R2s. So um, you can think of this a little bit as a decathlon. We measured institutions across 10 different measures: science and engineering expenditures, our non-SME expenditures, our science and engineering research staff, and then doctoral production across 4 different fields: social science, humanities, STEM, and other. And then so as to not penalize our smaller institutions, we also did that on a per capita basis to be able to, try to even out sort of the playing field. And what we would do is we would take all of the institutions that were in the R1, R2 universe. So in 2021, there were 279 institutions that awarded more than 20 PhDs and expended more than $5 million in expenditures. And we would rank from 279 high to 1 low, all 279 institutions on each of these 10 measures. And then we would take that rank and then multiply by the appropriate principal component analysis coefficient that you can see here to the right. And we create a weighted rank. We then sum those weighted ranks to create a single number. We then zero index that out. We do that for the per capita index too. We do some fancy math, square root of x squared plus y squared to calculate distance to origin. And voila, we would create a rank from 279 high to 1 low of our sort of the universe. And then what we would do is we try to go to the middle, look for the cutoff, and look for the largest gap between the points below the median. And so what that resulted in was this R1, R2 map. So in 2021, this is what the R1, R2 universe looked like. Our blue dots are our R1s, our green dots are our R2s. And what we did was we tried to cut the universe in half. We didn't quite get it. So there are 146 R1s here and 133 R2 institutions. But what we did is we established the universe and basically tried to cut it in half. Now, let me make some observations about that, right? When I say that it was the R1, R2 cutoff is a little bit arbitrary. It is arbitrary to make a decision that you're going to have the cutoff be at half, right? In some sense, there are a whole set of, you can see that there's some green dots right on the line and some blue dots right on the line. And I'm not so sure that these institutions are very different in terms of their research capacities, just by dint of sort of cutting it off at a particular level that we were going to try to cut it in half, that we end up in this sort of place. It's also the case that there's several institutions that are green dots here that are doing a tremendous amount of research. So, I mean, we have some institutions that are green dots, R2 institutions in 2021 that were doing 175, $200 million worth of research expenditures, had, 100 research doctorates, but weren't R1s. And the reason for that, actually, when you look at the way this math works, it really rewards a certain amount of comprehensiveness in your degree profiles, right? Because you are ranked on 10 different measures, if your institution didn't have a particular type of doctoral production, you weren't a social science institution, or you didn't produce STEM doctorates, you would take a 0 in those fields. And so it was very difficult for some institutions to be able to sort of overcome a 0 in a social science doctorate, a 0 in other fields for that doctorate field, and then be able to catch up with the rest. And so one of the things that this previous slide said is that the methodology rewarded comprehensiveness, and it did. For an institution to become an R1 institution, it wasn't enough that your institution was doing a lot of research expenditures and was producing a lot of research doctorates in a particular field. You actually needed to produce research doctorates across a whole set of fields. Okay, so when institutions understood this, I mean, some of this understood this, a couple of decades ago. Others understood this because we went out in the field and really tried to explain what this math meant, there were a whole set of institutions that said, aha, I get it. So my institution can't just be amazing at humanities doctorates. We're going to have to create a STEM doctorate or vice versa. And so what they'd sort of turn to me and say is they would say, okay, well, now we will create a doctorate in English or in engineering or whatever. And that might be, by the way, the right thing for that institution to do to be able to serve the students that it's trying to serve. But it worried me a lot that what the institution was going to try to do was create a doctoral program for the purpose of sort of gaming this Carnegie situation, Carnegie math. So after quite a bit of reflection and a lot of talking to the field, we are going a little bit back to basics. So you might recall that in 87 and 94, we had a simple threshold approach. We're going back to that threshold approach going forward. So instead of this complicated math, where we are trying to sort of determine who the R1s are and R2s are by using a principal component analysis approach. Instead, we're going back to a simple threshold, and any institution that awards more than 70 research doctorates in a single year and expends more than $50 million as reported to NSF Herd will be an R1 institution. And it doesn't matter what those research doctorates are in. You can do 70 engineering research doctorates. You can have 70 PhDs in English. Either way, just as long as you have 70 research doctorates and you expend more than $50 million, you'll be an R1 institution. Our R2 threshold will not change. So that has been this $5 million in expenditures, 20 research doctorates have been the numbers for the last several cycles, and we will keep them there. And then this last column of research colleges and universities, I'm super excited by. So, it has previously been the case that we only recognize the research that was done at institutions that were awarding doctorates. But it turns out, and then when we do the math and when we sort of looked at the universe, there's a whole set of institutions that are doing a lot of research that are not offering research doctorates. So think our baccalaureate institutions, think your Morehouse College or your Occidental College. They're doing a lot of research, but their mission doesn't have them trying to create research doctorates doing PhDs. They're focused on the undergraduates. That amount of research had been sort of hidden in the Carnegie classifications in this sort of highest degree model that we had. And when we looked at the institutions, there's actually more research happening from an expenditure point of view in this column than is happening in the research two column. And so we are going to, going forward, recognize all the institutions that are doing more than $2.5 million worth of research in a separate list called Research Colleges and Universities, and we will publish that alongside our R1s and our R2s. And we couldn't be more thrilled to be able to really highlight the whole range of ways in which our institutions of higher ed are really doing research in this country. Last thing, and then I'll take a breath. I just wanted to highlight what is in the gold. Previously, this math was done on a single year snapshot, and it was a little bit surprising when you look at the data, how much expenditure spiked in whatever the Carnegie classification year was. And actually, so did doctorate production, amazingly. We're going to smooth all of that out by going to a 3-year rolling average going forward. So instead of just looking at a single year snapshot, we'll be looking at your 3-year rolling average. But for the 2025 classification, which will come out next year, because this is new, we will give institutions sort of the benefit of the doubt, and we'll look at either your most recent single year or your 3-year average. So especially in this weirdness of the years after COVID, we know there's some strangeness in some of the data. We want to smooth it out, but also give institutions as much benefit of the doubt as we can and get as many institutions into these categories as sort of deserve to be there. So that's what we are thinking about from a research point of view. I'd love to get over to social and economic mobility, but let me pause here and see what questions folks have on either the basic classification or the research changes that we're making.
Thank you so much. And there are questions, and for those who would like to add their voice, please use the Q&A and we'll get to them in turn. So Shauna Cox asks, in thinking about the classification grouping like with like, has there been any consideration of private versus public?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shauna. Yes, quite a bit of thinking about public versus private. And one of the things that's sort of interesting is that I'm going to go back a bunch of slides if I can. You'll note that the classification right now, as it stands, has not made a distinction between publics and privates, and has everybody sort of playing in the same sandbox. I think that there's no question that when you talk to an institution about like what are the types of institutions that are grouped with me, that public and private rises to the top of the list. So um, I'm not sure if it is going to be sort of a driver here, but there's no question that in the work that we do when we publish our classifications, you'll be able to create groupings of your own, and public and private will be one of the things that you'll be able to sort by because we know that it's really quite important. So thank you for that question. It's
So
quite a
this
good
will
one.
be a sort of data portal, is that the idea?
Yeah, yeah. So I think what we will likely do, Michelle, is have some basic classification to sort of start and then let you filter from there. So if you wanted to, we might just have a classification that's these two award level focused academic program mix, and then let institutional researchers filter by size, by public private, by highest degree, by the amount of remoteness, by online instruction. I mean, there's a whole set of things that we've been thinking about using here that will probably allow folks to be able to create groupings on in their own custom groups, which I think is
I
an
think that
important
would
sort of thing.
be tremendous, as someone who spent a fair amount of time digging through stats. The number of times Wikipedia became the aid to try to figure out what was going on in Carnegie, I think was probably don't want to admit too much of that, but in fact, people did stuff like that.
No,
So that'd be great.
my predecessors over at Indiana University were running this thing on, 1.25 FTE. It was really, I mean, it was a portion of people's jobs. We're really lucky. We've raised a decent amount of money to really think about the ways that we might be able to create a better website that might be able to allow institutional researchers, especially, be able to get in there and be able to do some cool things, both from a visualization point of view and also from a data point of view. So hoping to get you some new tools, Michelle, going forward.
Well, I will definitely say that this is one group that will always like to see a tool demonstrated. So just consider we'll bring you back to show us that when it's ready. But
Oh,
we
I
have,
can't wait.
yeah, we have more questions. Joshua Rosenblum asks, do characteristics of student population play any role in Carnegie classification? Should
Yeah.
they? His second question is, does it make sense to have one classification scheme to rule them as opposed to different classifications for different purposes?
Yeah, one ring to rule them all, right? If I remember my Lord of the Rings. Joshua, great questions. Let's do the first one first, if that's okay. Do characteristics of student population play any role in the Carnegie classification? Should they? Have the question of have they played any role is just a little bit, but not really. I mean, so in this old map, um, the number of students that you had in certain programs defined a little bit where you were in the small, medium, large for master's colleges purposes. And then in the associate college space, the types of degrees that were offered and like how many students transferred did sort of play in there. But certain characteristics, like um, demographics of race or gender or age, weren't included in the Carnegie classification. And observing that actually, ACE and the Carnegie Foundation decided jointly to sort of create this new social and economic mobility classification. And so you're going to see some student population characteristics show up in the SEM, which we'll talk about sort of next. So should they? I think maybe, and we're thinking about this next classification as a way to be able to get students in there. You'll tell me whether or not it makes as much sense as you sort of want to make. The second question, does it make sense to have one classification to rule them all? Um, Joshua, I think you're quite right that I think different end users use these things for different purposes, right? And so you might want to know who the institutions are that are doing the most research for one reason, and that might have a different set of you might have a completely different set of criteria for groupings if you were have a if you're thinking about sort of faculty pay or if you're thinking about um, any number of questions. So I think you're right that different classifications might be sort of useful. It is part of the reason why we are really excited by thinking about data tools, right? And so we are hoping to be able to allow actors to be able to create their own sort of groupings based on what you're interested in. So if what you really want to know is who are the large public institutions that are awarding primarily STEM degrees, we're going to be able to give you the tools to be able to sort that way and then be able to do the research that you need to do for whatever purpose that you have for your sort of questions. So we will have a base classification that'll be the base for which we think is the sort of the most intelligent way to be able to group like institutions. But from there, we know that 1,000 flowers are going to bloom, and we hope to be able to give you guys um, the website to be able to sort of be the soil for those flowers to be able to grow.
Couple more questions, thank you.
Yeah,
Uh, what shift have you seen between R1 and R2 designations based on the new criteria? You know
yeah,
that's on
great question.
mine.
So I don't have the most recent data to be able to answer that question for sure. So I don't know with 100% certainty. With that said, having looked at the previous year's data, we're not going to see a very different list of R1 institutions to start. So there were 146 R1s last time. We think that there'll probably be another 25 or 30 R1s this time. There was sort of natural growth anyway. I mean, in any given year, we were adding 5 or 10 sort of new institutions. There might be a couple of R1s that don't meet the 50 million and 70 research doctorate threshold, and that might move from R1 to R2, and there'll be a set of R2 institutions that will move over. Maybe the biggest shift actually into R1 will be a set of special focus institutions that were offering most of their degrees in one field. Um, some of those institutions are doing a ton of research. Think the University of California, San Francisco. They're doing tremendous amount of research. They were not classified as an R1 institution because they were a special focus institution. So there will be a dozen or so special focus institutions that will also be classified as R1s going forward uh, because of the amount of research that they do. But we don't think that this is going to, in the first year, fundamentally blow up, who's an R1 and who's an R2. But going forward, I think it'll really allow institutions to be able to game plan for sort of how they move to R1 in a more intelligent way. It'll take away some of the weird incentives for having to create doctoral programs that maybe weren't exactly what the state or the student body needed, but were just being created for Carnegie purposes. And maybe most importantly, we'll just make clear to the world what R1 is and what it isn't. I mean, what R1 will be going forward are institutions that are awarding more than 70 doctorates and have more than $50 million worth of expenditures. And that is a clear sort of threshold. It is what it is. There's not going to be as much sort of mysticism around it. I should have said one thing, Michelle, that I didn't say. Uh, we've been publishing these classifications on a 3-year cycle. We'll continue to go on a 3-year cycle going forward. And I think that our plan is every cycle to reevaluate whether 50 and 70 are the right thresholds. And I think that actually from an expenditure point of view, we can expect that that number is likely to go up year over year, right? Or cycle over cycle, given inflation, given just the amount of research that's happening. So I wouldn't game plan for 50 and 28, but sometime probably in calendar year 26, we will tell you what the threshold is for years going forward.
I think that's helpful to know. Although I know of many institutions right at that 50 million threshold who are like, we're gonna be R1 now. So I do think it'll be interesting to see how that expectation is managed because it is a threshold number. Robert Butera says that his question was answered, but I did want to read his comment nonetheless.
Sure.
I hope that's okay, Robert. He says, I applaud adding the doctoral graduates criteria since it's much harder for institutions to game and it represents a long-term trend at the institution. I suspect that that's part of your thinking or was part of the thinking. Is that correct?
I think I was a little bit less worried about institutions trying to like game the system, though there's probably a little bit of that was happening. I think that the worry actually was that once they figured out what the rules of the game were, the games were like the rules were a little bit um I don't want to say rigged, but they were just a little odd. They were a little in opposite to, I think, what we were trying to sort of measure. And so I think part of this is just trying to be much clearer about what are the criteria and what are we trying to do. So I was a little bit less worried about institutions like trying to game a system as much as I was worried about a system whose rules were just so strange. Let me just give you an example of sort of the problems I think in the classification. So, um, there's a whole set of institutions that have been prevented by their state from offering social science and humanities degrees. You know, or um, didn't have in their mission to offer social science and humanities degrees. So think about North Carolina A&T, for instance, right? An HBCU, North Carolina public institution, excellent institution. In their mission, has the agricultural and technological sort of in right in their name, right? That is what they are doing, and they're STEM institution, they're an excellent STEM institution, their PhD production. They were never going to be able to be an R1 institution because their mission wasn't to create social science and humanities doctorates, but to and in North Carolina, they kept for many years the social science and humanities doctorates at Chapel Hill, right? I mean, and all the other institutions are supposed to be able to do all the other things, but they sort of jealously guarded the social science and humanities at the flagship institution. North Carolina is just one of several states that had that plan. That just meant that there was a whole set of institutions that could be doing so much research, tons of research, but we're always going to be shut out from being R1, R2. Simplifying this math, simplifying sort of the rules, I think hopefully will make for just a more intelligible sort of world going forward. That was what we were really thinking about sort of tackling.
I wonder, that example just sort of brings to mind something that I think a lot of institutions are thinking about, and that is for HBCUs, does this then change the landscape in terms of, I think it's an access issue, right? Because as you point out, there's resources that are tied to your classification, and there are ways in which institutions may have been systemically excluded from being able to be considered R1. Does this classification change that game? I mean, I think we're still wondering, when will there be R1 HBCUs that emerge and have kind of staying power in that role? And how do you think that changes, the way that people look at institutions? Does it matter? Is that chase an important one for us to be thinking about in this classification discussion?
Mm. Um, they're excellent questions. I think on the when are we going to see an HBCU become an R1? I think um, I don't have final data yet, so I'm a little bit loath to make predictions, but I think potentially as soon as this next classification in a few months, because there are institutions that are there are HBCUs that are doing a lot of research, and just by dint of this weird sort of math, we're sort of shut out a little bit from becoming R1s, and I think that we will probably see an R1, an HBCU that's an R1 in 25. And if not, I have no doubt in 28 that we will see some. Um, and I think that is a good thing. And it's a good thing not because we've watered this thing down to try to be able to get some HBCUs into this into R1 status. It's just that the math was strange and had some sort of um, systemic strangeness in it that was baked in that I think harmed a whole set of institutions, HBCUs and other regional publics that weren't able to offer all of the types of degrees. So I think the simplified math will improve the system. In terms of the question about the R1, R2 chase, and how important R1 is, I think I'm going to I think I'm going to duck it, if that's okay. Just duck the question altogether. Um, because I mean, I don't know how important it should be and how important it is. And I think to the good question that came earlier about different uses for these classifications, I think for certain funders, I think it might be really important to know who the R1s are. And for others, maybe not as much. I don't know. I do know one thing though, and this is going to be my segue over to the social and economic mobility work. When we took this project on, I talked to a lot of the big funding agencies, so NSF, NIH, NASA, others, um, and they said, thank you for sort of simplifying what R1, R2 meant. Thank you for telling us what this meant because they didn't understand all this math. They just sort of assumed, I think, that our R1 institutions were the ones that were either the best or at least the most capable of doing research. And again, looking at these criteria, it's not exactly the case that that's true. But they also said, look, one of the things that's really important to us is that we diversify the pipeline of institutions that we're giving grants to. Um, and can you tell us like where we should be giving our grants, basically? And that's part of where the social and economic mobility work comes in, because I think what we are hoping is that going forward, actually, let me go back a million slides. We are hoping that going forward, our funding agencies will look at not just the gold part of this classification, but will look also at the social and economic mobility part of the classification, so that institutions that are giving grants out will have a couple things in mind. And so let's talk about social and economic mobility and what we're
Sounds
thinking there.
good. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Here's where we started. So friends, there is no shortage of social and economic mobility rankings that are out there in the world. Seems like there's one that comes out literally like every week. Uh, there was one that came out last week that I was looking at. And I just put some of them up here with some of the data that they're using. And, I think when I took this project on, I think the team and I sort of thought maybe what we should do is just like look at all the rankings that are out there, examine what their methodology is, and just try to gild that lily. Let's try to figure out like maybe they don't exactly have the right weights. Maybe we can think about it in like a slightly different way and come up with the best ranking. But actually, I'll stay here for a second. As we thought about it for some time, I think one of the things that we decided was that we wouldn't do a ranking. We're the Carnegie classifications. And I think that there's some real danger in ranking institutions for reasons that I'll talk about in just a second. So here's some approaches that we took. First thing to sort of note, when we think about students, we wanted to make sure that we were including all students. So some of these rankings that are out there only look at the outcomes for completers. Turns out, although our completion rates have been sort of generally improving, it's not the case that 95% of our students are completing. Only, about 4 in 10, 6 in 10 are completing, 4 in 10 are not. And we wanted to include a measure that included all students. We also really wanted to make sure that we were comparing sort of like to like. So part of the impetus for the groupings that we are doing is making sure that we were understanding that different parts of the higher ed ecosystem were offering different types of degrees. So here are our most popular bachelor's degrees. Here's our approach on social and economic mobility. We really, I think, are going to lean hard into the fact that we are the Carnegie classifications, that we are going to have a smarter set of groupings of institutions. And I think that's step one, is to compare like to like. So the problem, in my view, with these rankings is that they mostly are comparing institutions from 1 to 1,400 or 1 to 4,000, and then are ranking them from 1 to 4,000. Not really comparing like institutions together in any sorts of groupings. So, Cal State LA is number 1 in third ways ranking, Harvard is 776, something like that. I'm not sure that Harvard is looking at Cal State LA and saying, that's an institution that's like me in terms of mission or types of students that we offer. And I think because of that, I think that there's a whole set of institutions that look up to Cal State LA and are like, that's not us. That's not who we are. We do something different. And so just like disregard the project altogether. I think that the first step seems to me to be able to compare institutions that are like each other. So no institution can just disregard the project because they're being compared to an institution that's not like them. And then once we've created that grouping, I think it's really important for us to assess institutions on 2 different measures. One is the access that they're providing to the community. And the second is how well those students are doing in terms of outcomes. And then that sub bullet under two is really important. To do this right, it feels like we really need to make sure that we're accounting for the location that your institutions are in and where your students are coming from. And our hope is that we're going to be able to present this in a visual way that's going to be able to do more to illuminate than sort of obscure. Things we are not doing, not creating a ranking. This is not a straight ROI measure. There are others that are doing that. And we didn't design the system to try to intentionally penalize a particular type of institution or reward a type of institution. We're going to see where the data sort of takes us. Why do we need to take location into account? I got a bunch of slides on this. I'm going to run through them quickly. These are things you all know. Pell enrollment varies pretty widely by state. And so if we're not taking into account where your students are coming from, which states they're coming from, might we might be doing a little bit of a disservice. So, an institution's got a 30% Pell rate. Is that good? Is that not so good? Are you serving the population? Are you not? Well, it depends on which state you're in, right? If you got a 30% Pell rate in New Mexico and 40% of the population is Pell enrolled, then maybe you're not doing as much. At other states, maybe it's not so, maybe 30% is quite good. I mean, you see that in Pell, man, do we see a wide variation in sort of people of color across states. I mean, this is stuff that everybody, of course, knows. But again, your institution's 35% students of color. Is that good? Is that not so good? Again, it depends a lot on where you are. When we think about income, again, wide variation. So, there's states that where $50,000 worth of income is a lot, and others where it's not nearly, it's not enough. It's not enough. And we know that this is true sort of across races as well. That different sort of earnings by race, the sort of power of being able to earn by race is varies a little bit. Varies. And then to sort of put all of that together, this is not a slide that's supposed to be read exactly or consumed, except to note that there are highs and lows here, right? I mean, that geography and race sort of matters when we think about how well any institution is doing on some of these access and outcomes measures. So knowing that, we are going to adjust for race and geography. Actually, let me do one more. Earnings vary not just state to state, but also vary within states. This is something that you all know very well, right? But your average earnings of $64,000 in Texas. Well, I mean, if you're in Austin, I mean, the starting salary is much higher. If you're in the Rio Grande Valley, right, it's much lower. And we know some of this stuff, and I think we can do something about it. Now, part of what we know are where your students are coming from. So we know from on a state-by-state basis how many of your students are coming from any given state. And because of that, we might be able to do some adjustments for it. These are our bachelor schools. You can see that something like 15–20% of schools really have all of their students coming from one state. And then we've got our sort of our national institutions down here on the bottom right. Our associates colleges, none of this will come as a surprise to you, but most of our community colleges have most of their students coming from one state. And we know that location changes over time, but that, in the first few years, where your students are coming from dictates a lot of where they're sort of going to end up after graduation. So this is just a quick study of some Arizona schools. And you can see what percent of students at Northern Arizona, Arizona State, and University of Arizona are coming from Arizona. Those are that 65, 64, 58% numbers, and then where they are a few years afterwards. And you can see that 30 years from now, they'll move all over the place. But in the first few years after graduation, many of them are staying in Arizona. And we've done some work around sort of some alumni story, studies about where students are going as well. So all of which is to say, here's some sort of feedback that we've gotten about the classifications. first, we need to have some universal data to be able to compare institutions across the entire cohort of 4,000 institutions. Institutions have told us, please have your approach be understandable. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about these rankings is um, they're really hard to crack the math. It's really hard to know what's going on underneath the surface. And US News won't even publish really exactly what their methodology is. Some of it's like a black box. I was talking to the president of an institution that's in the top 10 of one of these rankings. And I said, hey, congratulations, you guys are doing so great. And the president said, yeah, no, that's great. I have no idea how we got there or what we're doing, but we'll put it on a banner because it looks good. But they actually don't know. Because the math is sort of complicated and a little bit obscure. We are hoping to do something that's way more clear, way more understandable, and makes sense sort of intuitively. And knowing that there's these other projects that are out there, we are hoping to add something that's sort of complementary to it and not try to upend or displace some of those other rankings. And we're going to keep sort of working on this. Maybe the most important insight is the one that we just spent 10 slides talking about. Location and race matters. And one of the things that's sort of really interesting about these rankings is that they're really not taking geography or race into account. They're not doing adjustments. But here's the thing, we can do adjustments. We know we have good data on some things that we can adjust for to try to be as fair to your institutions as we can. And the groupings are going to matter a lot because if we're comparing like institutions to each other, then we won't be comparing STEM institutions to institutions that have much more of a balanced sort of program. So these are some of the things that we are hoping to do. And this is what it might look like. So again, just remember that every institution in spring of 25 will get a classification. This is one way that we could sort of visually present the classification. Instead of a ranking from 1 to 4,000, we can instead sort of do a 2 by 2 and group institutions within a group of like institutions. So you've got your group of 150 institutions that are like you. We can start assessing how well institutions are doing on access and outcomes. So here we've got outcomes on the y-axis, access on the x-axis, and we'd start mapping institutions onto those two measures. And so we did that for a particular group that we were looking at. It's all anonymized data, but this is a real group, and each dot on this map is an institution. And you can see, right, that if we sort of assess how well institutions are doing on access and outcomes, that there's some institutions that are high flyers in the green, some that are both low access and low outcomes institutions in sort of the orange. I mean, I think some institutions that we might want to ask some questions about. And then there's a negative slope here, with some institutions, a lot of institutions in the blue, either providing relatively lower access and having higher outcomes, or, vice versa, higher access and sort of lower outcomes. And we might do, instead of a 2 by 2, more of a 3 by 3 approach, because you can see there's a whole set of institutions that are in the middle. We're playing with this question about sort of 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 now. But we're pretty set on is measuring how well institutions are doing on access and how well they're doing on outcomes. Now, how are we going to measure access and outcomes? The million-dollar question. Here's what we're thinking. We're thinking on the access side to do sort of a 50-50 split on Pell enrollment and then the racial composition of your student body. Both of those relative to location. And then on the outcome side, we're thinking about a very simple measure, post-attendance earnings of all aided students. That's why I threw that completion slide up earlier. Like, we're going to do an all student measure, and we're going to be looking at earnings. And we'll adjust that for location, we'll adjust that for race, and we'll compare sort of an actual earnings measure to a predicted earnings measure. So we know for any given location what your Hispanic students or Hispanics between the ages of any age range, 25 to 34, make on average. And we know what your students sort of earn as well, and we can do some adjustments to be able to do an actual to earnings predicted ratio. And when we do that, we will be able to sort of give you a score on access, give you a score on earnings, and then we'll be able to map you on a 2 by 2 or 3 by 3. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. This group X part is really in some ways the big key to this, right? Comparing like institutions to other like institutions so that, um, the Colorado School of Mines is not going to be compared to Cal State LA. Very different program mixes, different types of students. You'll be in different groups for those purposes. Okay, let me stop. Just looking at the clock and see if folks have questions on this approach. Michelle, if you have questions about this approach, let's sort of start and then see if the group has questions about it.
Yeah, there is a holdover question from the prior section just on the R2 cutoff, which I believe is 20, correct?
It is 20 and 25. We will look at this again in 28 to see whether or not 20 will be sort of the right cutoff going forward. But for 25, it is indeed $5 million worth of expenditures, 20 research doctorates.
Thank you. So for this, which I found, I don't know about others, I find it very provocative to be thinking about how you could actually do this analysis. Again, you're doing it. You don't have to apply to have this done, unlike the community outreach one where you do a separate sort of data gathering process.
That's correct, Michelle. This is every institution is going to be getting this. Part of the reason that we have to rely on universal data is because we are pulling data that everybody has. So we will be getting our earnings data from the college scorecard, your Pell and racial composition numbers from iPads. These are all numbers that you guys will be providing and that we will be using.
You mentioned in the beginning of this presentation that you have spent a fair amount of time doing outreach with organizations, not only federal funding agencies, many of which are represented here, but also with organizations like US News and World. Have you gotten a response from some of those groups that create these sort of parallel assessments about how this particular side of the classification might affect the way they look at the quality of institution and what their ranking systems are?
Yeah. So from the funding agencies, I think we've heard, and please chime in if any of you are on the line, and please either correct me if I'm wrong or double down if I'm right. Many of them have told me we'd love to be able to get a fuller picture of an institution. So not just know how much research they're doing, but know other parts of what the institution is about. So for them, I think it's really important for them to know, is the institution that we are giving money to, are they capable of doing a lot of research? And then where are they on this sort of map? Are they more of a high access institution? Are they sort of a lower access institution? And I think many of those funding agencies have told us they'd like to be able to give dollars to institutions that really are committed to social and economic mobility. Those would be the institutions, that are doing sort of well on both scores. But you might be more interested in the access side. You might be more interested in the outcome side. From an ACE perspective, the American Council on Education, we've been around for 100 years. One of the things that's in our DNA is convening and sort of learning from each other. So we are likely in sort of the years going forward to try to bring institutions together to be able to solve sort of common problems. So, I have a dream that we're going to be able to bring, our lower access, high outcomes institutions together to be able to talk about like, what are the ways that we might be able to drive toward higher access? How can we think about different ways in which we're recruiting? We're doing great on outcomes. Our students are getting great jobs, are doing well on the income side, but we're lagging a little here, and vice versa here, right? Like, what are the types of conversations we can have with these folks about, pathways to jobs? What's the internship sort of look like? Do we need to worry about career advising? Is the reason that our outcomes aren't good because our completion rate's not that high? Like those sorts of questions are things that we can sort of tackle when we bring like institutions together that are sort of solving common problems. Right now, these rankings from 1 to 4,000 don't allow for any of that. I mean, there's just nobody has any path to sort of improvement. And that's what we're sort of hoping we're going to be able to do here. I don't know if I answered your question, Michelle.
Oh, no, you did. So I just want to make sure everyone is clear what will be coming forward. There'll be a multidimensional characterization of an institution plus social access plus research designation. Have I got that right?
You got it right. It's a lot to do in a little bit of time, but it's been
It
fun.
is. I know. It's quite impressive. All right, we have some questions.
Yeah.
Stephen Post says, so you have outlined a nice way of multidimensional classifications of institutions, but it seems that R1 versus R2 versus research is separate from that classification and still reduces to the number of PhDs awarded and funded, correct? I don't know. I
Uh,
think I kind of broke it down, but you'll do it much better than me, that's for sure.
no, no, no. Stephen, I think you're exactly right. That look. Let me go back to the old map. So I'm sorry for those of you guys might be like having flashing slides moving all over the place. I'm sorry about that. Stephen, this old map had your Carnegie classification if you're an R1 or R2. This was everything that we told you about your Carnegie classification. And going forward, as Michelle sort of noted, we will publish an R1, R2 list, and your researchness, the amount of your research, will be sort of boiled down to your doctoral production and your research expenditures. That's the research part. Separate from that, you will get a basic classification, and separate from that, you'll have a social and economic mobility classification. I used to work at the Department of Ed, as Michelle sort of noted at the top. And I was chief of staff in the part of the department that like had the Office of Post-Secondary Education sort of roll up to us. And one of the questions that we used to ask in our grant applications was, what's your Carnegie classification? It's actually usually question number one. And I think going forward, we'll probably ask three Carnegie classification questions, right? What's your basic classification? What's your social and economic mobility classification? And do you have a research classification? And those three things sort of together, we hope, will inform a much more holistic view of what an institution is and not just look at the research part. And hopefully that'll be useful because again, I mean, classifications are used in so many different ways. Research is part of it. It's not the only thing that matters. And so it's really important, I think, for us to get our arms around the entire institution. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Shauna Cox asks, some of Mushtaq's presentation, or states, some of his presentation, particularly about earnings of students who attend versus compete, reminded me of the three-part series that Freakonomics Radio did recently about college. I only heard bits
Ooh.
of the part, but it might be of interest to the group. So just a little tidbit for those of you who may not have heard about this before. I think you're absolutely right to point out and remind us of how many different organizations kind of read into the way the rankings sort your institution for their own purposes. And it would seem to me that if one was trying to strive towards helping support both understanding what we have in the landscape of higher ed, but also pursuing equity kinds of resource access questions, that this has got to help support that equity goal. Was that intentional? Am I reading the wrong thing into this? But was that part of the design consideration that you put into this and the team you've been working with put into this when you rethought how to do Carnegie?
Yes, I think so. Look, I think for us, the revisions of the basic were really, in some ways, mostly about trying to group like things together. Because we thought that um, this just moving institutions, sorting institutions by highest degree, just had a whole set of institutions that weren't like each other together. I have a slide sometimes about the types of institutions that are in Masters Large. There's 600 institutions here, and they are like vastly different. Um, I mean, the R1 space, I gave you three examples. I can give you three more. I mean, Dartmouth and University of Hawaii Manoa and UTEP are all R1 institutions. They couldn't be more different institutions. So it was really important from the basic point of view for us to get that right. But to the question earlier, the basic classification is really about sort of institutional degrees, and like the type of, what the it's really about degrees and sort of both in terms of type and in terms of majors and that sort of thing. But I think folks are also interested in like what's the student population, and that's where the social and economic mobility work comes in. And some of that's about equity, some of that's just about sort of just highlighting what our institutions are from like a little bit of a different perspective, from looking at it not from what's the institution offering, but who's the institution serving. And once you get there, I mean, there are questions of equity that are sort of sprinkled all the way throughout the classification. But we are indeed trying to assess how well are how well is this an institution doing at providing access to lower income students and to students of color, and then how well are those lower income and students of color actually doing out in the job market. Those are questions that are intentionally baked into the social and economic mobility work. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to give everybody a chance to do a question if they have it, because we're at the end of our presentation. We have a little bit of time if you have questions. But of course, I could ask questions all day long. So I
Well, and
want to
you
make
can
sure other
find
people have a
anybody that's a little shy to ask questions now. Uh, it is easy to find me. Actually, let me just go to the last slide so I can put the title on. You guys can find me whenever you have questions sort of going forward. And probably am answering 8 or 10 questions a day. So like, don't hesitate. Lots of data here that I'm not showing you guys. Ah, shoot. I can only get to the last title slide. Come find me. Sarah Gass, whose email is there, is my deputy on this project. M. Gunja is me, of course. And I look forward to staying in touch. Thanks all for hanging with me. And thank you, Michelle, Sarah, Maria, Barbara, everybody on the team for bringing me here today.
Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. You cannot see everybody here, and James Luther, great discussion and presentation. You can't see the hundreds that are in the webinar, but on behalf of all of them, I just want to thank you for joining us here in the FDP world. This is a group of people that loves good data, loves a great chart. So just know that they're with you on this data discussion, and I'm sure they will be socializing this back at their home institutions if they're not already aware of this, and there's more congratulations coming in on the chat. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time with us here today.
Absolutely. Data nerds of the world unite. We'll go take over the world. Thank you all.
Sounds good. Bye everyone. We'll see you at the next session.
Bye.